Hello, everybody. How are you? Thank you for being here. Can you guys hear me well in the back? Is it good? Yes? OK. So patterns and practices for Aura and Lightning Web Components. We're going to talk a little bit more about Lightning Web Components than in Aura. Let me present first. You will see that our accent is very similar. We're both from Spain. So sorry if I speak weird. On the right here, we have Gonzalo. Gonzalo is the principal engineer on the components team. If you have an issue with components, you can ask him. Also, we have Ray as well, if you have any problem with components. And I'm Diego. I'm one of the architects of LWC. How many of you have written LWC so far? OK, half of you, more than half. That's great. Everyone should be building LWC. It's great. It's awesome. If not, it's my problem. So we're going to divide the talk in two pieces. I'm going to talk a little about what does it mean for a component. What is the API of a component? Right? What are the dependencies and what that means for a component? What does it mean to have a component but reusable? Especially with LWC open source, you're going to be able to take your components and put them in platform, off platform, and whatever you want. So how do you make a component that can work in those environments? And then Gonzalo is going to drill a lot into the specific API implementations details. Should I use an API that is programmatic or declarative? Should I use slots? Should I use how do I do events in a proper way? What does the state mean for my component? What are the implications of that? So we're going to kind of show an example. We're not just actually build this component. We're going to think about a component like this as we go through the examples and patterns, right? So we're going to answer two questions at the beginning in my part. The first question is, what is the API surface of my component? And you will see that it's actually more than meets the eye. And the second question I'm going to be able to answer is, what makes my component environment dependent? What are the other things, the dependencies, how that influence where my component can run? And again, Gonzalo is going to go deep more into exactly why. So we're going to build this component. We're going to build this carousel item. Okay? We're going to have JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. So in LWC, and again, some of this applies to Aura as well, we have the first part, which is we build the foundation. We import LWC. We extend from Lightning element, which is the class, and we declare two properties, right? In Aura, you have the attribute, public attributes. In LWC, we have the decorator API. So what we're saying here is that, hey, we're declaring a property API. So we're telling a developer that's going to use this component is going to use this API, and I'm going to declare this method called update data, right? This is very obvious. This is the very trivial API shape. But also know that the LWC, what the component is saying is, I need this dependency to run, right? And of course, LWC is going to be there, available in every context, but you will see that there are going to be some that is not the case. Let's say we're going to internationalize our component, right? We're going to make it such as it works in other languages. I'm from Spain, so let's try to make it English and Spanish. So what we do is in platform, right, is we have this special import. And this import is special because it's contextual. So when we're building a component, right, sometimes we're bringing dependencies that are actually depending on the context. So we're going to see at the end how that plays out. So someone needs to be able to resolve this dependency. And in English, if the browser is in English, we should have to actually resolve a value that is in English. So all this dependency, it has some special context, right? So we need to be aware when we're building a component, what are the dependencies that we bring in, and are they those contextual aware or not? And we're going to see more examples of that. So the next thing we're going to see is a component might actually be data dependent, right? And in general, that is a bad practice. So you want to separate your components. So for example, in a carousel, you don't want the carousel to be data bound. Why? Because you are making your component depending on some data. And maybe the context where you're running, maybe it's Heroku, maybe it's commerce, maybe it's marketing cloud, might or might not have this data. So as a general pattern, again, this is just code to show you what are the dependencies you need to look after when you're building components. In general, we want to avoid data-bound components if you are presentational components, and just be very careful where the components are responsible, which component is responsible for fetching the data, and make that very explicit. Make that you don't want a lot of components in your tree to have data dependencies, because that means dependencies across the environment you're running against, right? So when you do it, just make sure that you have a decoupling between the components you want to be presentational and the components you want to be data-bound. The next thing we're actually going to see is events. Think about events not only as just firing an event, but also as an interface as part of your API. For once, you have to actually import a component, right? You have to import something that needs to be available. Again, let's assume it's a carousel event. But more importantly, when you dispatch an event, it's actually a part of your API. You're expecting somebody to react to that event, right? Which means that someone in the chain has to be responsible for fulfilling the event that you're firing. In this case, we're just firing like the select event. And Gonzalo is going to talk about the principles and good patterns to not having to fire all of the events to the wall and how to minimize the amount of exposure of our APIs. And you might think that that's enough, right? That is my API, is what I put in my JavaScript, my API, like the decorators and things like that. But actually, there's more. there's more. The another way to actually expose APIs is through the template. You see there we have this slot attribute. A slot is basically a declarative way to basically say, hey, my component accepts things inside me. Again, in the carousel, you will have a slot. And what that means is that actually someone can pass a component to me, and that component can be anything, right? And so Gonzalo is going to talk a little bit more exactly what does it mean. When do we choose one versus the other? When do we choose a decorator API versus when do we use a slot? Again, when we compose this component, right, every dependency we put, it's also something that we need to be careful with. What are other dependencies this component bringing? Is Lightning card bring a lot of dependency with it? Does it have also other dependencies? So it's no longer your component, but actually the composition of the components that matter. And you have to be just mindful when you build your component, what our components are bringing, what are the dependencies they are bringing with it. And finally, something that maybe is not really understood, but with web components, or with components in general, CSS is also part of the API. Anything you put on the host, on the custom element, is something that a customer can actually style from the outside, right? So the things that you put there, if you put a border box, maybe someone want to override it. Maybe someone don't want the border box. So what are the default values that you provide? And also, what are the variables, the CSS custom variables that I'm using, right? Again, every variable that you put there is exposed to the outside world. So again, this is all the API. So what is interesting here is when you build a component, it's no longer what you put in your JavaScript, but it's actually what you put in the HTML as slots, what you put in your CSS on the whole styles, and what are the CSS variables you do. So, and also what are the dependencies that my component is bringing. So this is kind of the high-level approach of what are the things that I should take a look at when I'm building a new component, right? And now Gonzalo is going to walk you through what are the specific internals and what are the things you guys need to do or can do to basically improve some of the API's ergonomics and some of the specific internal details of stateful components and eventing and how that minimize the amount of exposure that a component will have for anyone on the chain. So Gonzalo, take it away. Oh, sorry, I forgot one part. So I was talking about, think about a component as an interface, right? It has a little bit of pieces, and every component is compounded of different little dependencies. And again, the components that I compose with also have a set of dependencies. And so if I have a component that needs data, someone is to provision that data. And so think about your component running in different places. If I'm in Lightning platform, right, the dependencies that my component have might actually work just fine. It has data, labels, things from Wire, and that's fine. But maybe if I'm running in communities, I might not have those dependencies. So again, we just need to be aware of all of that. And again, if we're in Heroku, maybe we don't have Apex, for example, in Heroku. If my component is using Apex directly, maybe I want to decouple as we talk about. And again, now for sure, I'm going to hand it to Gonzalo to talk about the component tree.
All right. Thanks, Diego. Okay, so now that we have talked about all the API and dependencies, let's get building. So the first thing we want to be thinking about is our component tree. So a few things. When you're thinking of your component tree, you want to reflect a healthy, maintainable state and structure. You also want to break it down with reusability in mind, and also using other parts like web components or native HTML elements. But don't overdo it, because if you decompose too much, then you can get into trouble, maintenance trouble, performance troubles, and so on. And if you're coming from Aura, just a word of advice, and you're thinking of porting to LWC, start doing that with full trees. Don't just go component by component, but do trees and dependencies. All right, so back to the carousel. We're going to decompose this and see what all this means. So first, we're probably going to have some sort of container. The container is going to house everything that goes inside our component. And then we'll talk in a minute about what a container means. Then we're going to have an image. So the image is a presentation of our carousel, and that's where we're going to put all of that. We're going to need some sort of pagination control so we can see which image is selected, and we can help navigate from one to another. And also a button right here that's going to allow us to pause and play the carousel. Now I added this little thing right here, the pagination dot, just to show you an example of when it's too much to decompose a component. So those dots are probably not needed to be a full component. Again, it depends on your use case, but don't over decompose. Okay, so now we have all the pieces. How do we put them together? Well, there's two ways to do this. We can either use slots or data-driven. There's no right or wrong answer here. and it all depends on your use case. So let's explore some pros and cons. When we're using slots, what you're going to get is an easy and portable API. Low code, very declarative. Now, on the con side of the house, it relies on the slots. So what happens with the slots is that nothing that is being passed to you, you have no control. So you don't really know what's going to be passed to you. And so you're going to have to add some guardrails around it and whatnot in order to properly display the carousel. One more thing, too, it implements and relies on parent-child patterns to communicate between the parent, container, and contain. And we'll see what that means. So here's how it will look like when we're using slots. Pretty simple. We have a carousel, and then we're passing just some images with a source attribute, and that's it. Easy to read, easy to port, beautiful. Now, when we're using DataBound attributes that are dynamic, we get the benefit of being able to encapsulate all the implementation. So now everything we control from the data point down to the smallest detail. What this means is that the internals are encapsulated, and you can do and allow rapid changes, and it's easier for maintenance and refactors. Accessibility also is easier when you do this because of the encapsulation. However, cons. Now your users are going to need some basic knowledge of JavaScript in order to use your component. And the structure and the data is not part of your API, which is a little bit awkward. It's not a standard, just weird. Also means that in the future, if you choose to port this component to another framework, you might not be able to do so, since dynamic values are not something that's standard today. So here's how it will look like. We just now have a class, and this is where we have the images, and we pass it to the carousel. So again, no right or wrong answer, just different approaches. Remember when I was talking about the parent-child registration pattern? Let's go into that. So establishes a relationship between two components, container and contained. It's best when you break it down into containers and presentation components. The way you do this, the parent sends down the information to the child, and the child communicates with events up to the parent. So the parent, it's a container. It has very little style to it, and it just is in charge for all the logic, all the mechanism, and the state of the component. That's it. And it communicates with its child with properties that the child has passed down to the parent. So looking at some code, this is how it looks like. This is how the pattern will reflect. So we have a slot change event, which is, by the way, something that is standard web standards. Every time the slot change event fires, the container handles that. The slot change will only change or fires when there is a new child that is being added or removed, not when there is an attribute change. So that's very important. So here's this example. All we're doing is just getting the images, selecting the first one. Simple. The child is just a presentation component. It's very agnostic. It doesn't really know what is being displayed or how it's being displayed. It doesn't really care. It just have styling and communicates with its parents sending events. Now, next up, attributes. Let's talk about the attributes of our components. So remember, I've been stressing about this the whole time. Attributes are being passed down to the child. And you don't want to be sending data very complex types. You want to rely on primitives, strings, integers, Boolean, and so on. That's a really good practice. The one thing is that you never get to modify those values. You can never modify what's being passed down to you. But you might have to get that value, do something with it, and display on your template. So let's look. In this case, for the image, for the carousel image, we need to normalize the URL of the source attribute. So if you see the setter is grabbing what's being passed down to us, making a copy, and then calling this normalize URL that is going to do all these operations, and that's the one we're going to use in our template right here. So again, we're not modifying what's being passed to us. We just make a copy, and then we work on that. But how about complex data attributes? I say you should avoid them, but that doesn't mean you cannot use them. There are a few good cases for this. So let me show you one. Just know that when you do this, your API will become more complex. But think of a data table. A data table will be super awkward to having to pass a bunch of columns and data in a declarative way. So this is when you probably want to be using this type of attributes. And again, think about your audience. Who's your audience? How are you going to port this component? These are the important questions you want to be thinking when you're designing components. Now, there will be times when an attribute depends on another, which is kind of tricky. And you don't have a way to know the order on how you're going to get those attributes. So a setter might require another value from another setter, and it's just weird. So the way to avoid this is you have a custom getter. So when you have a custom getter like this, now when that gets called, you're guaranteed that those two values are going to exist. They're going to have something in it. So our greetings component now is going to be able to display a full name. Speaking of states, let me show you something that we consider best practice. If you're new to web components, you're probably thinking of doing something like this to change the state of your component. So in the case of our case of a carousel, maybe you're thinking of like just getting the image and slapping a class into the element, right? Wrong. So you don't want to do that. The way you want to manage state is you want to let the engine handle everything for you. Do not touch the DOM. So if there is one thing you want to walk away with from this talk, one of them is like you do not want to touch the DOM. If you're touching the DOM, chances are you're doing something wrong. So in this case, we have a getter that is going to do all the work for us. Clear, simple, and easier. So speaking of the DOM, let's wrap it up with events. So events are a way to communicate from a tree that is down up to the parent. They're part of your API. So if you're firing an event, know that they're part of the API, which means that you want to document it, you want to namespace it right, and know the boundaries and know what to do. So don't propagate events unless you know what you're doing, which means when you propagate an event, and we'll see an example, bubble up to pass your component, you want to make sure that anything on the template who's consuming you is able to understand that event. And same with the information that is being passed to you with the event. And lastly, this is evil. Do not ever use compose equals to true. Another takeaway. And we'll show you why you don't want to be doing that. So let's look at some examples. In the image, in the carousel and carousel image example, the carousel image here is just firing an event every time it's connected. So it's letting the parent know, hey, I'm here. You can interact with me. And it's doing so with just a new custom event and period. That's it. Now the parent can listen to it, but cool, I got you. I'm going to need to interact with you. So something like this, right? Clean, simple, not polluting the namespace, stays at the carousel image level. Now, there will be times where you're going to need to bubble things, right? So if you're using slots, for example, you are going to need to bubble because you need to cross the slot boundary. And again, do that with caution. Make sure it's a private contract. Make sure you stop propagation. Make sure that someone is doing the right thing and understanding what's being passed up. And finally, our friend here, compose, evil compose. So here's why we don't want to ever use this. And the reason why is because if we put compose in the same event that we have, now anyone can listen to it. So this random dev up in the page now can listen to Child Connect. Doesn't really know what that is. What is Child Connect, right? So don't use compose. Summary, Diego,
I'm going to wrap it up really quick.
wrap it up really quick.
10 seconds. So from my end, just basically decouple your component, decouple the data versus the UI presentational component. That's the very first learning that we did. Props down, events up, as Gonzalo said. There's no bidirectional data binding. Everything is clear when data goes up and events goes. Data props goes down and events goes up. And lastly, watch for the internal dependencies, right? Think about the stuff we talked at the beginning. Not only just the API is the API, it's just the CSS, it's just all of the dependencies you have. So think about those dependencies when you build your component. And from your side,
events, minimize what's composable, so don't use compose true. Watch out for bubbles. Properties, favor primitives, integers, strings, booleans. By the way, booleans cannot be true by default, so just that's for a different time. And then let the engine do the job for you. Do not use query selector. Do not touch them. And I think that's really what we have. So thank you for coming.
That was quick. And you guys have questions, we'll be around.
Yeah, we'll be around.